They didn't ask his name. They didn't check his ticket. They didn't wonder why a 17-year-old black boy stood quietly in a first-class lounge. They just decided he didn't belong. In the space of seconds, he was profiled, questioned, and surrounded. But what happened next wasn't anger, wasn't chaos. It was clarity, because he didn't raise his voice. He raised the bar. This is not just a story about race or airports or clothing. It's about perception and what it takes to challenge it without yelling, without violence, but with truth, presence, and unwavering self-worth. They judged him in seconds. He changed everything in minutes. This is the story of Jaylen Harris, and it starts the moment he walked in. The lounge wasn't just a waiting area, it was a statement. Soft leather seats, polished glass, and quiet conversations that smelled like wealth and power. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, planes roared on the tarmac. But inside, time held its breath. Everything was hushed, filtered, civilized. It was the kind of place where silence meant order, and order meant control. Then the door buzzed. Heads turned, just slightly. He stepped in. 17, hoodie on, calm but alert. Not loud, not reckless, just present. His name was Jaylen Harris, but no one in that room cared. Not yet. The gray hoodie was all they saw. He scanned the room, politely, respectfully, looking for a seat near the window. In his hand, a first-class boarding pass and a lounge invitation. He gripped them both carefully, as if sensing they might be questioned before they were seen. He had every right to be there. But in places like this, appearance often speaks louder than credentials. A woman stood. Navy blue suit, tightly pinned hair, lips thin, pressed in habitual disapproval. Her name tag read, Marjorie Green, lounge supervisor. She didn't smile. She didn't greet. She judged. This lounge is for premium guests only, she said, her tone clipped. Jaylen nodded calm. I know. I have a first-class ticket. The airline gave me this lounge pass. He held it out, neatly, confident but respectful. She didn't take it. She didn't even look at it. Her gaze remained fixed on his hoodie, her mind already made up. Security to the executive lounge, she said into her earpiece. Possible unauthorized access. It wasn't what she said. It was how she said it. Measured. Cold. Like reading off a script. Like filing a report before an incident even began. Jaylen blinked, thrown off for only a second. Ma'am, I can show you my ticket. She turned away. We'll let security decide. In that moment, the lounge changed. The air, once calm, now held a charge. The music didn't stop, but it faded into the background as the tension swelled. A man paused mid-sip. A woman looked up from her phone. Jaylen could feel the weight of glances, quick and uncomfortable. He didn't shrink. He didn't speak again. He just waited. He had learned through years of quiet trial and error how to make himself small without looking weak, how to stand his ground without inviting a fight, how to breathe through moments like this. The glass doors opened again. 2 security officers entered, one tall and solid, the other younger, eyes alert behind square glasses. They walked with practiced calm. We got a call? The taller one asked. Yes, Marjorie answered. This young man claims he belongs here. Jaylen spoke before they could. I have a boarding pass, first class. I was upgraded. You can scan it. He offered the pass again, along with his ID. The younger officer took them. The older one just observed. Marjorie crossed her arms. He walked in like he owned the place. Didn't even check in properly. Jaylen wanted to protest, but he knew that tone. He had heard it before. In stores, at school, on sidewalks. The tone that said, "You don't belong, and I'm going to make sure you know it." The younger officer walked out with the documents to verify. The older one stayed, his stance neutral but unmoving. Jaylen stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by strangers trying not to stare. A space designed for privacy had become a stage. Not because he asked for attention, but because he existed in a way that disrupted someone's expectations. The seconds crawled. The silence deepened. It wasn't a natural pause. It was a suffocating stillness, full of judgment that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Someone whispered, "They just let anyone in these days." Another voice lower, "No dress code anymore?" Jaylen heard every word, chose not to respond. Instead, he focused on his breath, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Stay calm, stay grounded. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't reach for it. He just waited. After what felt like 10 minutes but was barely 4, the younger officer returned. "Everything checks out," he said. "First class, ticket, valid lounge access." The taller officer gave a nod. "You're cleared." Jaylen took back his ID and pass. "Thank you," he said. Marjorie didn't move. Her expression didn't change. No apology, no acknowledgement, just that same tight-lipped dismissal. He walked past her, quiet, steady. He didn't look at anyone else. He walked to the far corner near the window. He placed his backpack on the floor and sat down. The lounge didn't welcome him, but he sat anyway. He pulled out a book, flipped it open, didn't read, just stared at the words, letting his breath slow down. He could still feel it, the gaze, the air, the assumption. The hoodie, once a gift, now felt heavier on his shoulders. Not because of the fabric, but because of everything it meant in a room like this. Because in places where silence is worshipped, presence alone can feel like disruption. He didn't want to be angry. He didn't want to cry. He didn't want to leave. He just wanted to sit, to wait for his flight, like anyone else. But the room wouldn't let him forget. Not for a second. Not the supervisor. Not the glances. Not the way the tension never quite left the air. He closed the book, folded his hands, looked out at the runway, where a plane was taxiing into position. And just as he let himself breathe again, Marjorie returned. Her voice was quieter this time, but no less cold. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." He looked up. "Why? I already got cleared." She glanced sideways. "Some of the guests have expressed discomfort. We aim to maintain a certain atmosphere in this space." Jaylen blinked. "Discomfort from me? Sitting here?" She didn't answer. Instead, she repeated herself. "You'll need to wait at the public gates." Jaylen sat still, said nothing, but his eyes didn't waver. She tapped her earpiece again. "Security, please return to the lounge." And this time, Jaylen reached for his phone. He scrolled to a contact, pressed call. It rang once, then again. "Dad," he said, steady now. "I need your help." And just like that, the silence in the lounge was about to be broken for good. Jaylen Harris didn't grow up near airports. He grew up near bus stops, in a neighborhood where sirens outnumbered car horns and where the skyline didn't feature tall towers, just satellite dishes and power lines. The kind of place people pass through but rarely see. Yet somehow from a very early age, Jaylen saw everything. He saw the way sunlight shimmered off the wings of planes flying overhead. He saw the way his mother's hands moved when she counted out change for groceries, always calculating more than money, calculating survival. He saw the brokenness around him, but more importantly, he saw possibility. By age 9, Jaylen could tell you the difference between an Airbus A320 and a Boeing 737 by the sound of their engines. He'd sit on the rooftop of his apartment building, not to escape, but to imagine. He'd sketch aircraft fuselages in the back of his notebooks, label them with words he could barely pronounce: rudder, stabilizer, aileron. While other kids played street ball, Jaylen played with ideas: lift, drag, propulsion. He didn't want to fly planes. He wanted to understand them, to build them, to one day design something that could carry people across oceans safely and silently. He was curious in a way that made teachers either love him or feel threatened by him. He asked too many questions, finished assignments too quickly, corrected errors in textbooks. Some labeled him a problem, others a prodigy. His mother, Tanya, never used those words. She just called him her miracle. She worked 2 jobs: clinic receptionist by day, overnight janitor twice a week. She made sure Jaylen had clean clothes, working shoes, and a full stomach on test days, even when it meant skipping dinner herself. She never went to college, but she raised a boy who dreamed in blueprints and binary. When he was 14, he built his first drone from salvage parts, flew it in the park until a white woman called the cops because it looked suspicious. He was detained for 2 hours. The officers laughed when he cried. That night, his mother gave him the hoodie. It was nothing fancy, just a soft gray pullover with a small stitch plain over the chest. But it became a shield, a reminder. Wear this, she told him. When you walk into rooms they think you don't belong in. And when they look past you, let it remind you who you are. He wore it to every robotics competition, every scholarship interview, every flight simulation test. It became his armor, not against bullets or fists, but against assumptions. At 17, Jaylen had a GPA of 4.3, a near-perfect SAT score, and acceptance letters from 7 top engineering schools. But it was the letter, the National STEM Alliance, that changed everything. He'd been selected for the Emerging Innovators Award, one of only 10 students nationwide. The prize, a grant, national recognition, and a trip to Washington, D.C. to speak on a panel about aerospace engineering for youth. When the airline upgraded his seat to first class and offered him lounge access as part of the experience, he had smiled and said thank you. He had packed his speech, his charger, his mom's cookies, and yes, his hoodie. Because the hoodie wasn't just part of his story, it was his story. He remembered standing in the kitchen the night before his flight. His mom couldn't stop fussing over his bag. You got your boarding pass? Extra socks? Did you pack that extra portable charger? Yes, Ma, he laughed. I'm good. She nodded, then reached out and adjusted his hoodie strings like she had when he was 5. You walk in proud, she said. Don't let anyone make you feel small. He had promised her he wouldn't, but now in the corner of the executive lounge, seated in silence after being interrogated for existing in a hoodie, that promise felt heavy. He looked down at his shoes, clean, laced tight. He remembered the first time he walked into an engineering workshop at State Tech for a summer program. How all the other students were white, older, and wore polos with embroidered logos. He'd shown up in that same hoodie, worn but clean, and within a week he was leading their capstone project. He remembered his guidance counselor's expression when he turned down a sports scholarship to pursue aerospace science. I just thought, she had said. You thought wrong, he replied. Jaylen was used to being underestimated. It never got easier, but it got quieter. He had learned to let his work speak, let his code compile, let his calculations sing. And yet here he was, again, reduced to a fabric choice. He took out his phone, flipped through pictures. There was one of him at age 11, holding his first remote-controlled plane. One of him at the state science fair, beaming next to a solar-powered drone. One of him and his mom sitting on their apartment stoop, mid-laugh, eating popsicles. He stopped at the last one, a picture of the award invitation. You are cordially invited to the National STEM Alliance Summit in Washington, D.C. to receive the Emerging Innovators Award. Below it, his name, bold, clear, earned. Jaylen put his phone down, looked around the lounge again. The man with the bourbon was scrolling stocks. The woman with the magazine was now pretending not to watch him. Marjorie was still at the desk, typing something furiously. Security lingered by the door. He took a breath, sat taller, because he knew who he was. Not a problem, not a threat. A scholar, a builder, a kid from a neighborhood no one invested in, becoming the kind of mind they'd one day quote on a TED stage. Let them whisper. Let them doubt. They hadn't seen his blueprints. They hadn't seen his code, but they would. Jaylen had never raised his voice to prove himself, but today wasn't about proving. It was about reminding. So when his phone rang, vibrating quietly against the table, he didn't jump. He picked it up, saw the name on the screen. Dad. He pressed accept. Hey, he said. A pause. Yeah, I'm okay, but I need you to come in. He hung up and sat back. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay seated. Jaylen sat in the corner of the executive lounge, posture upright, face calm, but inside, a quiet storm was building. He had been cleared. That's what the officer had said. Cleared. As if his existence in that space was something that needed permission. He looked at the paper cup of water in front of him. No coffee, no soda, just room temperature water. Offered to him by one of the guards, not out of kindness, but as if that small gesture could erase what had just happened. Jaylen wasn't angry. Not exactly. He was awake, fully aware of the walls, the stairs, the conversations that had lowered to whispers once he sat down. Marjorie Green remained at her post, occasionally casting glances in his direction. Not long stares, just quick flicks of the eyes like a person checking to see if a fire had been put out completely. But Jaylen wasn't fire. He was the oxygen the room was trying to ignore. 10 feet away, a business traveler in a tailored suit was speaking into his phone. No, babe, it's fine. Just some kid wandered in. Yeah, one of those moments. You know how it is. Jaylen heard every word, and suddenly the silence was deafening. He stood up, slowly, picked up his boarding pass and lounge pass again, and walked up to the counter. Marjorie looked up, surprised. Maybe she thought he'd keep his head down. Maybe she thought he'd sit quietly and vanish into the background, like so many others before him. But Jaylen was done shrinking. Can I help you? She asked, her tone clipped, tight, but tinged with uncertainty now. Yes, Jaylen replied. You can explain something to me. She blinked. Explain what? Why you called security before you checked my documents? She opened her mouth, but he kept going. You saw a hoodie, you saw brown skin, and you decided something. You didn't ask. You didn't check the name. You didn't scan the pass. You didn't follow any procedure. You followed your instinct. And that instinct led you to treat me like a threat. Marjorie glanced toward security. The two guards were still standing by the door, trying not to be obvious about listening in. Jaylen leaned in, not aggressively, but firmly, his voice low, calm, clear. Let me ask you something, Miss Green. If I had walked in wearing a blazer and loafers, would we be having this conversation? Silence. He waited. She didn't answer. A man nearby coughed awkwardly. A woman reached for her bag and quietly relocated to another seat. Not out of fear, more out of discomfort. The room had become a mirror. Jaylen looked around. You all saw what happened. Some of you chuckled. Some of you whispered. None of you stepped in. He pointed gently toward the nearest business traveler. You, sir, you looked up from your bourbon and watched me get questioned like I didn't belong here, and you didn't say a word. Why? The man shifted in his seat, clearly flustered. I didn't want to get involved. Jaylen nodded. That's the problem. Silence feels safe until it isn't, until it becomes permission. He turned back to Marjorie. People like me walk into rooms like this every day, having worked twice as hard, jumped through every hoop, done everything right, and we still get stopped at the door. I wasn't profiling you, she muttered finally. Jaylen tilted his head. No? Then what would you call it? She hesitated. I was, following protocol. No, he said. You were following bias. More silence. Jaylen stood tall. I came here to catch a flight, to represent my school, to accept an award in Washington, D.C. I didn't come here to teach a lesson, but apparently someone had to. He walked away from the desk, back to his seat, but the moment he sat down, a different kind of silence settled in the room. One not born from routine, but from reckoning. Outside the lounge, Thomas Harris had already entered the terminal. He walked with the quiet confidence of someone who had fought in courtrooms that tried to swallow his voice. A civil rights attorney for over 20 years, he had built his career and his reputation on holding institutions accountable. And when his son's voice came through the phone earlier, calm but clipped, his father instinct had kicked in immediately. He was getting closer. Back inside the lounge, Jaylen checked his phone. 2 unread messages from his mom. Let me know when you're on board, baby. You okay? You went quiet, Jaylen typed back. I'm okay. Dad's on his way. He hit send. Then another voice. You know, said the woman from the magazine earlier, now suddenly interested. You really didn't have to make a scene. You got cleared, didn't you? Jaylen turned to her. I didn't make a scene. I spoke. But this is a lounge. It's supposed to be quiet. Jaylen's eyes didn't flinch. And quiet is how things like this keep happening. She said nothing. Behind the front desk, Marjorie's hands were still typing, but her posture had changed. Less confident, less automatic. Jaylen didn't feel triumphant. This wasn't a victory. This was survival. Yet again. Security radioed discreetly to the front desk. Marjorie answered. Yes? The voice on the other end said, There's a man at the front checkpoint. Says his name is Thomas Harris. He's requesting access. Marjorie froze. He says he's here for his son, the voice continued, and that you'll know who he means. Marjorie looked up from the desk and slowly scanned the room. Jaylen, seated, calm, waiting. She swallowed hard. 10 seconds later, the door buzzed. Jaylen looked up. The man who walked in didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to announce himself. Thomas Harris's presence spoke before he did. He scanned the room, his eyes sharp, calm, direct, not with rage, but with truth. He walked toward his son, placed a hand on his shoulder, and then turned toward the lounge staff. I'd like to speak with whoever thought my son didn't belong here, he said, voice steady. Marjorie took one step forward, then stopped. This was no longer about a hoodie. This was about accountability. And in that moment, the air in the lounge changed. No one reached for their phones. No one made eye contact. The silence that returned wasn't the kind that made things feel safe. It was the kind that revealed what had been hiding all along. Thomas Harris wasn't tall, but he stood like someone who'd been underestimated his whole life and learned how to make a room listen without raising his voice. As he stepped into the executive lounge, the atmosphere shifted. The door buzzed shut behind him, but no one spoke. No one moved. He wasn't just a father. He was something else. Something colder, more exact. His suit was clean but worn. His briefcase scuffed but full. His presence didn't demand attention. It required it. He walked slowly, deliberately toward the front desk, where Marjorie stood frozen, clutching her tablet like a shield. Jaylen watched from his seat in the corner. He didn't smile. He didn't stand. He simply observed the shifting gravity as his father took command of the space. Thomas reached the desk. His voice, when it came, was soft. "I believe you called security on my son." Marjorie swallowed. "I wasn't aware." "You were aware enough to radio in a possible threat," he said, holding up his phone. "I was on the line when he was surrounded. I heard the whole thing." Marjorie tried to speak, but Thomas raised a hand. Not loudly, not aggressively, just enough to make it clear. Not yet. "Let me explain who I am. My name is Thomas Harris, civil rights attorney, member of the state bar, advisor to the National Transportation Ethics Council. I don't say this for applause. I say it because when I speak, it's documented. When I ask questions, they are recorded. And when people lie to me, they tend to lose their jobs." The room had gone utterly still. Even the jazz playing softly through the lounge speakers seemed to hesitate. "I'm not here to yell," he continued. "I'm here to understand." He turned slightly, gesturing toward Jaylen. "My son, 17, award-winning engineering student, invited by the National STEM Alliance to speak at a federal summit, upgraded to first class by the airline, with full lounge access. Entered this space legally, calmly, respectfully." He turned back to Marjorie. "And yet, within 60 seconds of his arrival, you decided he didn't belong. No verification, no scan, no inquiry, just instinct. Whose instinct was that exactly?" Marjorie's voice cracked slightly. "Sir, our staff are trained to respond to any suspicious behavior." "What behavior?" Thomas asked sharply now. "What behavior did he display other than being young, black, and wearing a hoodie?" She faltered. "You say you're trained. Then you should know. When an assumption leads to escalation without cause, that's not policy. That's profiling." A murmur moved through the lounge. Small but real. People were listening now. Thomas stepped aside slightly and gestured toward the room. "Let me ask all of you something," he said, sweeping his eyes across the space. "What did you see when my son walked in? Did you see a student? A guest? Or just a threat in cotton?" No one answered. "I'm not surprised," he said. "Silence is the easiest way to preserve privilege." He turned back to Marjorie. "Do you know how many times I've had to teach my son how to survive moments like this? How many times I've had to explain that dignity isn't always a shield?" He looked down, collected himself. "Jaylen didn't need to be here today. He's not some troubled youth trying to sneak into a luxury lounge for fun. He's the reason lounges like this will exist 20 years from now, because he'll be the one designing the planes." That line landed like a stone. From the side of the room, the suited man who had earlier whispered on the phone now looked down at his shoes. A woman near the coffee station folded her arms. not defensively, reflectively. Thomas leaned in slightly. You called security, so now I'm calling accountability. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded letter. This is a formal ethics inquiry. I'm submitting it to your parent company, the terminal operator, and the FAA. Marjorie's face went pale. Not to get you fired, but to ask, who else have you done this to? And who never had a father walk in behind them? He paused, looked around again. You're lucky it was me, he said quietly, because someone else might have made a scene. I'm not here for vengeance. I'm here for correction. Then gently he took a business card from his wallet and placed it on the counter. You'll be contacted by our office within 72 hours. I'd recommend preparing your statement honestly. Marjorie said nothing. She nodded slightly, finally realizing there was nothing left to defend. Thomas turned, walked toward Jaylen. He extended a hand. Jaylen stood, took it. I'm proud of you, his father said, just loud enough for those near them to hear. You didn't fold? Jaylen looked up, the fight still lingering behind his eyes. I almost did. Thomas nodded. Almost isn't folding. They began walking toward the exit of the lounge, and as they did, someone clapped, just once, then stopped. It wasn't applause. It was acknowledgement. A few heads turned. No one smiled. But the weight in the room had shifted. A reckoning had come, and it hadn't been loud, but it had been heard. At the door, Jaylen turned and took one last look at the lounge. Same chairs, same windows, same stillness. But he wasn't the same, and neither were they. They didn't walk far, just a few steps beyond the lounge's heavy glass doors, and Jaylen paused. His father noticed. You all right? Thomas asked. Jaylen nodded. I didn't think it would feel this strange. Winning, if you can call it that. Thomas gave a soft laugh. It rarely feels like winning. It usually just feels like surviving, with receipts. They stood there in the quiet, travelers passing around them, oblivious to what had just unfolded on the other side of the glass. For them, the airport was just a space between things. For Jaylen, it had become a battleground, and now, strangely, a proving ground. A voice came from behind them. Mr. Harris? They turned. A man in a dark gray uniform with a badge approached. Not security. This one had wings on his chest, an airline supervisor. I'm with the airline. We were notified of an incident. I'd like to personally apologize to you, Mr. Harris, and to your son. Thomas stepped slightly aside. You'll need to speak with him directly. The supervisor nodded, then turned to Jaylen. I'm sorry for the way you were treated. That's not the standard we hold ourselves to. I can't undo what happened, but I want to offer something that may help restore a little dignity to your experience. Jaylen didn't respond immediately. He was watching the man's eyes, not looking for guilt, but sincerity. The man held out a document folder. We'd like to offer you a lifetime membership to our lounge program, fully covered by the airline. And if you'd be open to it, we'd also like to invite you to meet one of our senior captains. She's waiting at gate 17. She heard about what happened. She asked to speak with you directly. Jaylen blinked. Why? The man gave a half smile. She said, no young black man should leave an airport thinking he doesn't belong in the sky. Jaylen exhaled slowly, then nodded. I'll go. Thomas nodded too. I'll wait here. Jaylen walked. His steps were even, his shoulders squared. He moved past rows of shops, kiosks, monitors blinking delays and departures. Everything around him normal, mundane, and yet everything inside him had shifted. He arrived at gate 17, Waiting there in uniform stood a woman, early 40s, tall, poised, and unmistakably powerful. "Jaylen?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," she smiled. "I'm Captain Amara Johnson. I've flown with this airline for 17 years. I've had my share of rooms I wasn't welcomed in, but I stayed. And now I fly the planes that used to pass over my neighborhood when I was your age." He smiled back. "I'm honored to meet you, Captain." "No," she said. "I'm honored to meet you." She paused, then added, "Would you like to sit in the cockpit before your flight?" Jaylen's eyes widened. "Seriously?" "Seriously," she said. "Come on. They can hold boarding for 5 minutes." She led him down the jet bridge, past the gate agents, into the plane. The cockpit door was open. Jaylen stepped in. It was smaller than he imagined. More buttons, more screens. But it felt like everything he'd ever dreamed of, compressed into one sacred space. Captain Johnson stood behind him. "This," she said, "is yours one day. If you want it." Jaylen didn't speak. He didn't have to. She gently touched his shoulder. "Keep showing up," she said, "even when they don't clap for you, even when they stare, even when they doubt." She smiled. "You've already proven you belong." Jaylen nodded, took one last look around, then stepped out. Back in the terminal, Thomas waited near the lounge. Marjorie was gone, but one of the guards, one who had questioned Jaylen earlier, walked over. "Sir," he said quietly, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I didn't see it in the moment, but I see it now." Jaylen didn't say much, just nodded. "Thanks." Thomas and Jaylen began walking toward the gate. As they moved, Jaylen looked around. Not with suspicion, not with defiance, but with clarity. He saw people staring, but the stares felt different now. Not pity, not challenge, recognition. When they reached the gate, Thomas stopped. "I'm proud of you," he said again. Jaylen smiled. "This time, I felt it." They hugged. Then Thomas said, "I'll see you in DC." Jaylen boarded. As he walked down the aisle, a few passengers looked up, and a couple even nodded. He found his seat, window side, first class. No hoodie this time. It was folded neatly in his backpack. But as the plane lifted off, the clouds breaking open beneath them, Jaylen leaned against the glass and whispered, "I still belong." The plane had landed hours ago, but Jaylen still felt like he was flying. Not because of the altitude or the complimentary first-class service or the polite gate agent who greeted him by name. It was something quieter, something deeper, a shift not in scenery, but in self. He now sat in his DC hotel room, lights off, hoodie in his lap, not wearing it, just holding it. The same hoodie that once felt like armor, now felt like a story, one that had traveled through doubt and dignity, through assumptions and accountability, through silence, and then finally through voice. Jaylen looked out the window. He could see the Capitol dome glowing faintly in the distance, like a promise waiting to be tested. Tomorrow he'd stand on a stage, talk to a room full of leaders, speak about innovation, youth, engineering, the future. But tonight was about reflection. He opened his laptop. A blinking cursor waited. He began typing. What They Didn't See by Jaylen Harris. They saw a hoodie, but not the hands that stitched it, not the mother who gave it to me after skipping meals to buy the fabric. They didn't see the late nights under dim light, sketching flight wings while sirens howled outside. They didn't see a boy walking past liquor stores, head down, backpack full of books, praying not to be noticed. They didn't see the questions I asked in class that made teachers pause. They didn't see the journals filled with equations, the homemade drone that flew 8 minutes longer than any kit at the science fair. They didn't see my tears the night I almost gave up on applying to college because no one around me had ever made it. They didn't see my mother crying when the letter came. They didn't see the joy in my community. They didn't see my name on the boarding pass. They didn't even see my eyes. They just saw a hoodie. And in that moment, they made a decision that I didn't belong. But here's the truth. I always belong. They just weren't ready. He paused, reread the words, then saved the file. He wasn't sure if he'd share it. Maybe, maybe not. But writing it had brought something back. Not anger, not pride, clarity. He checked his phone. Dozens of texts from classmates, teachers, cousins. The story had spread. Someone from the lounge must have filmed part of the confrontation. It was already making its way through social media. He tapped on one video. There he was, standing at the lounge counter, speaking calmly but clearly. The caption read, "He didn't raise his voice. He raised the bar." He smiled, not for the likes, not for the shares, but because, for the first time, people were seeing the full picture. Not just the hoodie, the boy inside it. The next morning, Jaylen stood backstage at the National STEM Alliance Summit. The auditorium was grand. High ceilings, deep red curtains, a stage lined with engineers, educators, executives. He was the youngest person in the room by far. He looked around, then looked down at what he was wearing. Dress shirt, slacks, pressed blazer. But folded over his arm carefully was the hoodie. He'd debated all night. Wear it, leave it behind. But then he realized he didn't need to choose, because the hoodie wasn't the story, it was the symbol. He walked on stage with quiet steps. The room hushed. The moderator introduced him. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our youngest speaker, Jaylen Harris, recipient of the Emerging Innovators Award." Applause rose. He stood at the podium. Then gently he placed the folded hoodie on top of it. He didn't mention it, didn't gesture toward it. He just let it sit there, unapologetic, visible. Then he spoke. "Good morning. My name is Jaylen Harris. I'm 17. I design things that fly." Laughter, warm, welcoming. He continued. "I'm from a neighborhood where people learn to keep their heads down, where dreams take flight, mostly in imaginations. But thanks to mentors, late nights, and a mother who believed I could rewrite the equation, I'm here." He paused. "I was told to speak today about aerospace innovation. But before we talk about altitude, I want to talk about access. Because too often the places we're allowed to enter are shaped more by perception than potential." He let the words settle. 3 days ago, I walked into an airport lounge with a valid pass. I was told I didn't belong. No reason, no policy, just a judgment. He gestured toward the hoodie. This was the problem. Not my words, not my actions, just this fabric, just the fear it triggered. The audience was utterly silent. But I didn't walk out. I stayed. I spoke. My father came. Justice came. And eventually, understanding came too. He took a deep breath. "I'm not bitter. I'm hopeful." Because moments like that prove why we need more voices at every table, in every cockpit, behind every design. We don't just need new aircraft. We need a new altitude of thinking. Applause, strong, lasting. He looked out across the room. He didn't see doubt. He saw respect. Real, earned, irreversible. After the summit, dozens of attendees approached him. One professor said, "You reminded me why I started teaching." A CEO handed him a card and whispered, "When you're ready, I want you on my team." A little boy, maybe 10, ran up and said, "You look like me up there." Jaylen knelt down and smiled. "Then you already belong," he said. Later that night, He boarded a return flight. The same seat, the same aisle. But this time, something felt different. Not because of the class, not because of the service, but because he now understood something essential. You don't have to change who you are to take up space. You just have to stop apologizing for it. As the plane lifted off, Jaylen looked out the window again. Clouds parted, sunlight poured in, and for the first time in a long time, the sky didn't feel distant. It felt earned. 2 weeks after the summit, Jaylen's inbox was no longer just filled with college application confirmations. It was filled with stories, hundreds, from all over the country. Some came from students in cities he'd never heard of, some from rural towns where Wi-Fi was patchy and school buses ran twice a week. I wore my hoodie to school today for the first time since I got suspended for it, one message read. I showed my class your speech. They asked me if I could start a STEM club. I said yes, wrote another. My dad watched your video and cried. He said, that boy is who I wanted to be. Jaylen wasn't used to being anyone's symbol. He still did dishes at home, still fought with his cousins over game controllers, still forgot to reply to group chats. He wasn't a hero, but something had changed. He wasn't invisible anymore. News outlets began to reach out. Local, then national. He turned down the big talk shows, the ones that wanted to dress him up and script his answers. But he said yes to the school papers, the college blogs, the youth podcasts hosted from bedrooms. Because they asked real questions, because they listened. One interviewer asked, what's the first thing you want to build if you become an engineer? Jaylen smiled. A space where kids like me don't have to explain themselves first. The interviewer paused, then replied, that's not an aircraft. Jaylen grinned. It doesn't have to fly to lift someone. The airline reached back out, not with more perks, but with a proposal. They asked if he would be interested in working with their youth outreach division, creating workshops, designing mentorship programs for students of color interested in aviation. He agreed on one condition. I don't want to be a mascot, he said. I want a seat at the table where decisions are made. They blinked, then said yes. Captain Amara Johnson invited him to shadow her on 2 flights over the summer. He said yes, not just because he wanted cockpit time, but because he wanted to learn how leadership looked at 30,000 feet. One afternoon, mid-cruise, she turned and asked, you ever think about becoming a pilot? He hesitated. I always wanted to be an engineer. She nodded. You can be both. Never let them put you in one cockpit. Fly your own. By the time fall arrived, Jaylen had spoken at 6 schools, been featured in a STEM youth documentary, and helped organize a citywide Tech in the Hood expo that drew nearly 500 kids. At that event, one little girl asked, are you famous? Jaylen laughed. No, he said. I'm just seen. Her eyes lit up like that was even better. He hadn't been back to the lounge since that day, not because he was avoiding it, but because he didn't need it anymore. The lounge wasn't the prize. The sky wasn't the limit. Visibility was. Voice was. Value was. He had already arrived. One evening, walking home from a community meeting, Jaylen passed a mural on the side of an old school building. Spray-painted silhouettes of black boys in hoodies. Above them, in bold block letters, we belong in every room. He stopped. It wasn't his face, but it was his story. One of the boys in the mural looked just like him, standing, chin up, backpack slung, no fear in his posture. Jaylen took a photo, not to post, just to remember. A few days later, he received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside, a hoodie. Same color, same cut, but different words across the chest. Engineered for resistance. He smiled, and for the first time in a while, he put it on. Not for armor, for legacy. At the end of the year, Jaylen got a call from a university he had dreamed of, but never dared to fully expect. Full scholarship, advanced placement, research assistant position, he told his mom. She screamed so loudly the neighbor knocked on the door. That night she sat with him on the couch, head on his shoulder, and said, "You know what I love most? You didn't change to get here." Jaylen nodded. "They just finally saw who I've always been." He kept writing. He published an op-ed in a national newspaper titled, "Designing Spaces for Us." He didn't name the lounge, didn't shame Marjorie. He didn't need to. The story had outgrown the incident. It wasn't about one door. It was about how many doors were built too narrow for dignity to walk through, and how they needed to be rebuilt by hands like his, by minds like his, by stories like his. 1 year later, Jaylen returned to the STEM Summit, not as a speaker, but as a mentor. He brought with him 5 students, each from different backgrounds, neighborhoods, and realities, all wearing hoodies with their school logos, all wide-eyed, smart, and ready. As they walked through the airport together, a man approached, tall, older, a bit nervous. "You're Jaylen Harris, right?" Jaylen smiled. "Yes, sir." The man nodded. "I was at the lounge that day. I I didn't say anything, but I've thought about it a lot since. I just wanted to say thank you." Jaylen didn't lecture him, didn't correct him. He just said, "Thank you for telling me." Then turned to the kids behind him and said, "Let's go." As they walked toward the gate, one of them asked, "Do you ever get nervous before boarding?" Jaylen looked at him. "Every time," he said. "But that's not the important part." "What is?" "I board anyway." It wasn't until Jaylen came home for winter break that he realized just how far he'd flown. Not miles, moments. The neighborhood looked the same corner store with the flickering light, the same park where the basketball net had no net, the same bus stop bench with the graffiti no one had ever bothered to clean. But something had shifted. The air didn't weigh on his shoulders the way it used to. The silence on the street didn't feel like warning. It felt like memory. He walked the sidewalk slowly, his hoodie up, not out of fear, but out of comfort. This time he wasn't hiding. He was returning. When he stepped into the apartment, his mother was in the kitchen, humming. She looked up, smiled. "My son, the celebrity." He rolled his eyes, grinning. "I'm just a student," he said. "You're more than that," she replied. "You're a reminder." He dropped his bag and hugged her. A full, wordless, grounding hug. She held on a second longer than usual, because she knew. This wasn't just a visit. It was a turning point, a moment to breathe, before something even bigger began. Later that night, Jaylen sat in his childhood room. Nothing had changed. Posters of planets, a stack of textbooks, a whiteboard with faded marker stains, the model drone on the top shelf. He opened his journal, not his laptop. He wanted the scratch of ink, the drag of thought across paper. He began to write, "Where We Belong," by Jaylen Harris. We are not trying to enter your spaces. We are reminding you that they were never yours alone. We are not breaking in. We are returning to futures we were always meant to inherit, to fields we were always meant to plant, to skies we were always meant to fly. We walk into rooms with heads high, not because we are fearless, but because fear has followed us for too long, and we are tired of giving it the front seat. This hoodie? It is not a costume. It is not a threat. It is not your cue for suspicion. It is a story of love, of struggle, of invention, of arrival. We belong not because you accept us, but because the world is incomplete without us. He stopped writing, closed the journal. This was no longer just his voice. It was a frequency, and others were tuning in. A few weeks later, Jaylen was asked to give the commencement speech at a partner high school's mid-year graduation. He almost declined. "I'm still figuring it out," he told the principal. She replied, "That's exactly why they need to hear you." So he said yes. The gymnasium was filled. Students in purple gowns, families packed into bleachers, balloons floating near the rafters. Jaylen stood backstage, fingers grazing the edge of the podium. His speech was tucked in his back pocket. He stepped out. The crowd cheered, not wildly, but with recognition. Like they already knew who he was, even if they'd never met him. He spoke without notes. "My name is Jaylen Harris. I am a student, a builder, a hoodie wearer, a boundary breaker." Laughter. "But before all of that, I was just a kid who loved watching planes." He told him about the summit, about the lounge, about the silence, about the voice. Then he paused. "I don't want you to remember me. I want you to remember yourselves. In every room you enter, in every door that makes you pause." He looked across the sea of young faces. "Because if you ever doubt where you belong, look around. We are already here, learning, building, rising, and we're not leaving." The applause wasn't loud. It was long, the kind that stays with you on the ride home. That night, Jaylen walked alone to the edge of the city, to the hill just past the last row of buildings, where the sky felt close. He looked up. The stars weren't visible tonight. Too much light pollution, but he smiled anyway. He remembered the old Jaylen, the one who used to sit on the roof and name the planes overhead like constellations. He remembered how small he felt, and how that smallness had become the blueprint for something huge. He sat down on the grass, hoodie wrapped around his shoulders, and whispered, "We're coming." Not loud, but clear. Months later, in a quiet office at the university library, Jaylen clicked submit on the final proposal for a new student program. Flight Paths, a year-long mentorship pipeline connecting high school students from underrepresented communities with STEM labs, aviation experiences, and real mentorship from engineers of color. The program would be run by students, staffed by faculty, funded by partnerships. He didn't do it for praise. He did it because it hadn't existed when he needed it. Now it would. A week later, he received approval. It would launch in the fall. The hoodie, now framed, sits above his desk. A reminder, not of struggle, of arrival, of voice, of purpose. Sometimes when younger students visit his office, they point at it and ask, "Is that the one?" He nods. "Yeah, that's the one." They smile, because they know the story, because now it's theirs too. The hoodie, now framed, sits above his desk, a reminder, not of struggle, of arrival, of voice, of purpose. Sometimes when younger students visit his office, they point at it and ask, "Is that the one?" He nods. "Yeah, that's the one." They smile, because they know the story, because now it's theirs too. Years later, a journalist writing about educational equity asked him, "Do you think we're closer to where we need to be?" Jaylen paused, then said, "We're closer than we've ever been. But we're not just trying to get there anymore. We're building the place." And somewhere, across the country, a kid in a hoodie walks into a classroom, a conference room, a cockpit, a courtroom, and stands tall because they've seen the map and they know they belong. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He stood still and let the truth speak. What they saw was a hoodie. What he showed them was a mind, a voice, a future they never expected. This story isn't just about one boy in an airport. It's about what happens when you refuse to be erased. How long does it take to be judged? Seconds. How long does it take to change the narrative? As long as it takes to stand your ground. This was the story of Jaylen Harris. And if you've ever been told you don't belong, let this be your reminder. You already do. If this story moved you, don't just scroll. Don't just watch. Speak, share, stand. Tell us, have you ever been judged before you had a chance to speak? Drop your story in the comments. Someone out there needs to hear it. And if you believe dignity shouldn't depend on how you look, share this video. Let the silence speak louder. Because sometimes the quietest voice is the one that echoes the longest. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more Silent Power stories. Your support helps these voices be heard,